Hi, I'm going to talk about my experiences in Mrs. Askew's third grade classroom at Horizon Elementary. This is in Murray. First, I'm going to talk to you about the instructional setting. The classroom consisted of 25 students. It was mixed between ELL students and native speakers. They sat on yoga balls instead of chairs, which I thought was kind of interesting, but it kind of seemed like it kept them active and engaged. They had a clip up and clip down system for behavior, whereas if you were doing something right or if you were on task or something, you could clip up on the board, whereas if you were doing something wrong or behaving badly, you would clip down. This is kind of an interesting way to do that. Classroom seemed a bit cluttered. There was papers all over the back table where all the students put their homework and classwork, and it seemed very unorganized, which I suppose is not a big deal for this teacher, but the whiteboard in the back of the classroom had vocabulary words and sight words that they would put under each letter of the alphabet, so they would have them alphabetically listed. So students always had an opportunity to look at that. And I did appreciate that Mrs. Askew spoke very clearly and had a fun tone in her voice and made it a little more interesting to be in the classroom. Now I'm going to talk about some things I observed. First of all, Coleon, who is his first language is Spanish. He heard Mrs. Askew say the word vanilla, and he asked her if she said vanilla with like a B sound. And let me see if I can show this. So, kind of wrote this up. So the one on top is what he said, which is vanilla with the voiceless bilabial plosive, which is putting both lips together and making that b sound. And I wrote down the correct version, which is with the labiodental fricative with v, which is putting the teeth on the lips like this and making that v sound. So that shows kind of the incorrect way that he said it and the correct way that Mrs. Askew corrected him. I appreciate that Mrs. Askew was able to make those distinctions. However, she didn't really go as far as to saying maybe other words that have similar sounds and kind of getting a more clear meaning of what she was saying. It did seem to be effective, though. Coleon did see the difference in those. So as far as syntax, Alex, whose first language is also Spanish, he would ask me a question. He would say, "How do you," and then say a word, like a noun, like "How do you ball," or something like that, which I didn't understand what he meant at first. He kept asking and showing me on his paper, and then I figured out that he was asking, how do you spell that word, whatever that word was. He asked me a few times for a few different words, but he kept leaving out the predicate, or the verb, so he could have said, like, how do you spell this word, instead of how do you this word. The teacher wasn't around to assist when he asked me that, so I can't really say anything about that. But I did tell him, that he needs to make that distinction and add that word so I know what he's talking about, what he's asking. Rihanna, whose first language is also Spanish, she would write down, so for one of their projects, they were doing postcards in space. They were on a science lesson where they were learning about new planets and astronauts and stuff like that. And she wrote down "go to Venus, then home to Earth," which was missing a noun phrase, such as like "I would go to Venus, then home to Earth," or something like that. I tried to explain this to her without much success, and she turned it into the teacher, but I'm not sure if the teacher actually helped her with that. On to morphology. This one was kind of interesting because this was like half the class had a hard time understanding this when going through this. We went through writing past tense verbs. For instance, the first one was the past tense of the word fly. So we wrote sentences on the board. And we went through a few different rules, one of which being that if the word ends with a Y, you take off the Y and make it an I and then add ed. So a lot of them were confused and changed that to flied instead of flew. That one, Mrs. Askew and I kind of had to explain to them that it was just kind of an irregular past tense verb. And it's kind of just one of those sight words that they'd have to remember. Another one, however, was the word swallow. So the rule that we went over previously was that if it ends with a vowel and a consonant, you double the consonant and then add ed. So a lot of them spelled swallowed with two W's on the end and then ed. However, it's supposed to be just one W and then ed at the end. Mrs. Askew made a very good point that the OW on the end is a digraph. It makes one sound. So the students are learning these vowel patterns like OW, AR, stuff like that make a single sound. And yeah, we just let them know that, because it makes that single sound, you don't need to double the consonant at the end. It seemed like a lot of them understood that. Maybe not all of them, though. So for the sake of time, I'm going to go into part 2, which explains where I assisted and what I learned while I was in the class. So I assisted in spelling a lot of the time. So with students, I would walk around when they were doing their writing projects. And if they asked me how to spell a word, I would have them sound it out if it was a simpler, with more simple vowel patterns and just letter patterns in general. Tapping was a method that I used that I've learned in another class, where you would take your fingers like this and tap each individual sound. For instance, like the word cat would be k-at, and then put it all together to make cat. And that seemed to help a few of the students. And then reinforcing those vowel patterns, I think, was pretty important, like the AR and the double vowels, like AI and stuff like that. I also helped around with punctuation. They were learning how to write paragraphs, sentences, letters, stuff like that. Specifically, there was one that I tried to teach them where to put commas if you have 3 or more words or ideas in a series. So, for instance, the cat is fluffy, black, and mean. You would separate those 3 ideas, like fluffy, cat, and mean, fluffy, black, and mean, by those those 2 commas, so separating those. And they seem to catch on pretty quickly with that. I also would read aloud, so I would read chapter books every once in a while. And with doing that, I was modeling fluency and prosody, so I was modeling how it was supposed to be said and the fluidity, like how I was speaking, the tone in my voice, just stuff like that. Um, the most valuable thing I learned about English language learners, what they say and what they write may be completely different. So it seems to me that speaking a language is much easier than writing it. So a lot of these students, they didn't realize that they were writing incorrect syntax um, when they would say it out loud and it would make sense. So it seems like when you're writing, you don't really get the sense of what you're saying out loud. So I think that was kind of an issue that a lot of them had. The most valuable thing about teaching that I learned was that patience is incredibly important. It's easy to get frustrated, and sometimes you just have to take a step back and explain what they need you to explain. It's also a good idea to ask for questions, because a lot of these students, they don't want to ask questions. They're just there to kind of like listen. But if you ask for questions and somebody really doesn't understand, they will ask you, and it's just a lot easier to get them on topic if that's the case. And also it helps if they're interested in what they're writing in. Like I said, we were writing about astronauts and space and stuff like that, and I think a lot of them had a lot of interest in that, and that got their creative juices going, really, and were able to write quite a bit. At least 5-sentence paragraphs, and I was very impressed with that. The biggest takeaway for me was that syntax seemed to be the most common mistake with ELL students. So depending on the language, the order of words, like nouns and adjectives and stuff like that, are going to be different depending on that language. So when you're going into a new language and it's totally different, it seems like those words kind of get mixed up. And it's easy for me as a native speaker to see that they're using incorrect syntax. However, to them it might make total sense in their first language. So that's really all I really had to go over. So I'm going to end right there.